Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Exceptional podcast. I'm your host, Nat, and today we are going to be speaking with another very exceptional guest. They are a strategic business partner for social care at Oxfordshire County Council. They are also the co-chair of REACH, Race, Equality and Cultural Heritage at the Staff Network, promoting anti-racism and inclusion. They have 7 years of frontline children's team experience with deep insights into safeguarding and social care. They have authored anti-racism guidance driving systematic change in local government. They are also a member of the EDI advisory group at the British Horse Society. We're not going to be talking much about horses today, but still I thought it was pretty cool. And they very much believe in positive disruption and how you can integrate lived experience, challenging structural barriers, and shaping policies for all. So without any more delay, let's bring on Hema Patel. Hi, Hema. Great to have you.
Hi, Nat. Thank you for having me. That was a very kind introduction.
It's so great to have you today, and I've been very much looking forward to speaking with you about this. I would love to pass over to you to do your own introduction. Maybe tell us a bit about you and your relationship with neurodiversity, if you're comfortable to do.
Sure. Okay. So my key links probably with neurodiversity are around the EDI lead work that I do in IT. I don't have any direct lived experience, but I've learned lots about being underrepresented, having systems that don't necessarily work so well for you, through my work as one of the co-chairs for the REACH staff network, Oxfordshire. So lots of the similar barriers struck me as mechanically really similar, but just on a different characteristic maybe. So that was a hook for me to get involved with that work. And we've done quite a lot. So I lead the IT activity around EDI, and I've been doing that for a couple of 3 years now. We've had lots of wins. We also had lots to learn, and myself very much included in that. So I've really enjoyed learning the lived experience of others and being able to affect some change, hopefully positive change. Of course, there's always work to do, right? Hopefully we can make these things better and better. I suppose for me, so I did product design at the University of Leeds many years ago now. And I suppose the key thing that I took away from doing my degree was that actually everything around us, apart from nature and natural stuff, but everything around us is by design. And so fundamentally, in my view, we can redesign it. If we didn't get something quite right, if we realize that things have changed and we need to modernize, all of that is in our gift, because everything that's around us was put here generally by us or by somebody somewhere. And so in my view, it's open for development and growth, right? So that's partly where that drive comes from my point of view.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. We have got some really interesting questions to grill you on, so apologies in advance. Not the easiest, but I think you can handle it.
Not at all. I'm looking forward to the grilling.
You'll be like the most friendliest grilling you've had. The first question is expanding a little bit upon what you've just said, and I'd like to know what initially sparked your commitment to either neurodiversity or inclusion in local government. Because, for instance, you could have just done your role. You didn't need to get involved in all these kind of extracurricular activities, but you did. So I'd love to know how you got into it and why.
The short answer on that is probably unfairness. And when that happens upon people in our organisation, we miss out on enormous benefits and productivity when people simply aren't able to thrive and be at their optimum at work. The same applies, I think, both for neurodiversity and race equity, right? So in terms of the initial spark, I suppose I started to notice some of that inequity materially around me. And that's something that's hard to swallow. I would say my colleagues would probably also say that sometimes I can be a bit grumpy about that whole injustice thing, and that kind of initial sort of response of, that doesn't seem quite right to me. Hang on a minute, let's just have another look. And designer by nature, that iterative kind of process to get us to a better outcome is something that I've trained in and my mindset is very much aligned to. So what that means is that I was not wedded to the status quo. So where I was seeing inequities around me in a kind of a random way, really, you just notice things as you would go along, or you would hear something in a policy or a process that didn't seem to fit right, or certainly didn't seem to fit everybody. I suppose that is what sparked my interest to then look more closely at how we were doing things, why we were doing things, sometimes why we weren't doing things, both on neurodiversity and race. And it was interesting, the two sort of happening at a similar time for me in my career really showed me how there's tons of commonality in the kinds of inequities that we see around us, many of which, not all, sadly, when you look at history, but many of which have occurred by accident. You look at some of our procedural problems, our systemic barriers, often it's just because they've been created with one demographic or a small and narrow demographic in mind. And what shows up as inequity has often come from a place of ignorance. So it was interesting when my curiosity was sparked about why we were doing some of the things and not doing some of the things. When I went away and asked and talked to people, sometimes the answer would be, oh, don't know, never really thought of that. They'd be scratching heads response. There was certainly nothing malicious or with any kind of ill intent behind it, but actually I was often met with lots of kind of scratching heads. And also in these conversations, which is another kind of hook for me because I like learning, I also didn't have necessarily a better solution or an idea about how to improve something in that moment. I'd only gotten to the point of noticing that something perhaps wasn't quite as good as it could be. And in an organisation that culturally aims to see people thrive, you can't help sometimes but notice when we're at odds at that, because we have messaging all around us all the time that's steering us to thrive. And then when you're seeing people that aren't, you have to ask yourself why and ask others why, I think. I did start, I got my pointy elbows out and went along and asked people sometimes awkward questions and sometimes questions that might have made them feel a bit on the back foot, which was never my intention. But they ended up being really useful conversations because we started to do that thing, you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
Some of those questions, I suppose, helped us to see together that we didn't know some things. And actually, because of not knowing some things, we omitted some things in our processes and in our offer and in our policy. And that the upshot of that can be excluding people and either misrepresenting them or not representing them at all. Sometimes whole groups becoming nowhere near as visible as they could be. And ultimately, there's tons of national data, isn't there, about how much more successful and often profitable more diverse companies and organisations are. So it was really clear that as a result of this stuff, we'd be missing out in terms of the activity that we're trying to do to serve the community in Oxfordshire that we're working for. And so that all just didn't seem like the right place to be. So you firstly, it's that kind of realising that there's a problem. And not only that, we didn't know there was a problem until just having those conversations where we have the scratching heads, but then also realising perhaps we hadn't always got the knowledge to fix stuff. We hadn't always got the expertise to make the improvements once we'd spotted them, but making them visible is the first thing, right?
Yeah, I am definitely getting the feeling that we're very much a disruptor, and that's a good thing. It clearly comes across to me that kind of diversity of thought, because as you said, very few people are actually ill-intended. Most people are genuinely lovely people who want the world to be successful, but you don't know what you don't know. And if you have a small cognitive pool of different thinkers, then these questions will not be asked. Quite often, the things that discriminate us most, when you ask people, like you said, why is it a thing? Well, it's a thing because it's always been a thing. And you need someone to continually question, poke, prod, until you can refine and reform. So I think that's really great to hear. Passion comes very from like deep inside, and you know what, I'm sure it does annoy a few people, but I'm sure they are very thankful in the long run. And
might be right about, I fear you may be right about that.
I always look at the bigger thing of history, and every time we've made substantial changes, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's not because we did it because it was the right thing to do. We did it because it made sense for the business, for the government. I'm looking at like when we got rid of slavery or we gave women the vote and stuff, like you can look in a textbook and it looks like, oh, we did it because we were being nice. Like the UK, when the UK owned the entire planet almost, people think we gave it back because we were being kind. We weren't. We were bankrupt and we wanted to share skills. I completely get that. We need to shine light on the areas which need shining light on, but ultimately the change comes from businesses because it's the right thing to do for the business, opposed to it's a nice thing to do. And hopefully this leads me on nicely to the next question about how does race, neurodiversity, and other identities intersect with work, and what unique challenges arise. So again, like, how do they kind of blend together rather than being kind of separate pockets?
That's a really good question. It is a grilling. Well done.
Yeah, I know better.
Yeah. Oh, brilliant. So look, they intersect all the time. The thing about visibility comes to my mind when I think about this question, because I've worked with kind of lots of underrepresented communities in a professional space now. And what's really interesting is, as a woman of colour, recognising your own challenges. And I would say there are some which our parents, I'm thinking about race now, but there are some which our parents may have prepared us for. So I remember being very small and my family saying to me, sometimes you might find that you're the only person in the room saying what you're saying. And of course, what they're trying to do subtly is give me the tools to deal with some of the challenges that they faced with wider society and in their workplaces and professions, send me out into the world equipped to deal with that. I really appreciate that, and I wouldn't want it to have been any other way. But interestingly, what it almost did for me was over-focused on perhaps race. It was never framed to me by my parents as being race, but you learn this stuff passively and around you and you connect it, don't you? So I learned that they were talking to me about race there. But I completely missed some of the challenges that I might face because of gender, for example. Because in their eyes, that was probably the smaller battle, or the kind of less concerning or less visible kind of challenge that I might meet. And it's not until, so even on an individual level, there's that challenge, I think, about recognizing your own intersectionality, so that the two sets of separate components and then how they might overlap to impact your experience of things and impact how you'll meet things. And I've recognized that in colleagues around me a lot, is where we're talking about a process that doesn't work, or an experience that wasn't right, or whatever we might be reflecting on. Very much in the spaces that I share with neurodivergent colleagues, it's only kind of more recently that the conversations perhaps about gender are coming into play in the same conversation. So it's really easy, isn't it, to say, I'm not being well supported with my neurodiversity, and my manager doesn't really understand, and all of that stuff. When you start to, I suppose, when you gain a bit more learning, and references to our history are absolutely valid, because so much of what we have, why we are the way we are in our societies, in our professional spaces, comes from that. And it's not visible to us because we didn't really get taught it at school. But when you start to reflect on the whole picture and you look at the really low rates of diagnoses for neurodivergent women, particularly, how the upshot of that is that they're even more likely to be under supported or not recognized because they've already been not visible. And when they enter the workplace and stuff, that's kind of 10 times harder because they're female, just to even be recognized in terms of the position that they're in and not be judged as another typically sexist feminine trait, like being scatty or dizzy or those kinds of ditzy, those kinds of words that you commonly hear said about women, but which also apply sometimes with how people view neurodivergent colleagues who may not yet have a diagnosis necessarily, or may just not be getting the right support. And it's something, it throws up loads of really unique challenges. One of the ways I've tried to reframe that for people when we're working together has been to, rather than focusing on the challenges, the problems, is actually where are the strengths and what doesn't work for you. So this fundamental kind of thinking about the fact that nobody would expect our bodies to be the same. So we all accept that we're different heights, different colours, different weights, all of that. We take that as a given because it's very visible to us. But we go through school and through our education systems perhaps with a bit of an expectation that all of our brains will work the same, that we'll all have a really similar learning style, and we simply don't. And it's really interesting when you enter the workplace, I think, how when you're in a position where you can manage how you work and choose how you work yourself, you're so much more freer to work the way that suits you best. For me, I didn't learn about the different ways that I can work successfully and what's less successful for me until I was in a professional space. So until I was managing my own time, responsible for my own workload, I think it probably wasn't until then that I realized something that works really well for me to get all of my thoughts out is to write them down on an A3 piece of paper in multicolored pens. I don't know why that works for me, but it really does. So for somebody else, it's a spreadsheet, right? But until you're in an environment where that's allowed, you don't really get to test it, because we have these sort of rigid systems that we try and put everybody's different brains through the same system. And of course, they don't all succeed. So I try and, when we're talking about the challenges around all of that, I try and reframe the conversations in terms of saying to people, what works best for you? So no, there's no kind of template for that. We'll start completely with a blank page. How do you work the best? Is it time of day? Is it standing up? Is it moving around? Is it color coding? What would be your go-to? But from a completely selfish point of view, but it's to try and passively send the message to managers, other colleagues, other peers, that actually you can still be massively successful without working the same way as everyone else and without necessarily following the rigid policies and procedures, which you see a lot of in local government. Actually, like, we really like a well-organized system. We're really good at that. It doesn't mean that everyone can therefore thrive in terms of their interactions with it, because it just might not be set up for them to do in a healthy and a really productive way. And ultimately, we suffer, don't we, as a result of that? If we can't help people to be productive in the way that's best for them, we're absolutely missing a trick. But I think I've found it's about reframing that conversation through the process or whatever's considered the right way of doing something. Spin that for a minute. Don't worry about that. What's the way that works best for you? And then how do we get to a useful place? But it's been so interesting how many colleagues I've worked with who are still learning that and still working that out about themselves, and who don't necessarily recognize where they might have had a barrier along the way that's meant that they've not even been visible to themselves fully. They've just accepted what they've been. But you're not very good at that, or that's not your strong point, or that high-flying job probably isn't for you because you didn't have representation but in those years of your life where it's so important to have it. So I think there's lots in that, isn't there?
Oh, definitely. And I really resonated with what you said, that it's actually, for a lot of individuals, life is so much easier once you leave the school system, because you do then have the flexibility to learn in the way that you. And when we look at intersectionality, the fact that not one single thing can exist on its own, I often say to people, I've actually never met a single individual who just has autism or just has dyslexia, because we are accumulation of everything. If you are a woman, the likelihood of being diagnosed is less. If you are from a minority background, the likelihood that it has even been approached in conversation might be significantly less. If you're from a lower socioeconomic background, you probably won't have a diagnosis because the resources in your areas probably won't allow for a diagnosis to happen. These joining building blocks of what makes us isn't unique to a minority group. They are part of everything. So I really like the idea of finding what works for you personally.
Yeah. And it's really interesting when you think a lot about neurodiversity and race particularly. So my family originate from North India, and like many South Asians and just many underrepresented racial groups in general, actually many people of colour, all of those cultures really prize educational success and having a high-flying career, and that's all great, right? But it can make it such a difficult journey if you're a person of colour with a neurodiversity, because the barriers for you can sometimes be really immediate and can be in your immediate family. Your parents can struggle to accept that, and where culturally the culture that you've been born into may not have the same level of acceptance necessarily. Equally, there are some that are amazingly accepting of it, but there's that kind of, that each different culture has its own set of baggage around this stuff.
Micro cultures as well.
Exactly.
So family dynamic. It's it's definitely a pattern that I've seen in quite broad Asia, to be honest, where the expectation, contextually, I get it, because if your parents, say, originally emigrated, refugees, or however they ended up here, they probably had a very tough life, and working hard was the only way to escape poverty. So if you are divulging from the perceived norm, you are taking a gamble, and they don't want you to take that gamble because they've been on the rough side. And trying to understand why people have these expectations of you, while also trying to help shift their mindset to essentially be up with the times. Because each generation culturally is so different from the last, is, I can imagine, a very tight challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a different journey for everybody, but such a difficult thing to navigate through that and do the education, the understanding piece with your family, while still also working out how you can thrive as an individual with the differences that you have, and often with very few spaces where you can easily thrive.
Yeah, and hence you need to create them, which goes back to, again, your original motivation that you may notice things aren't working, but no one else has even thought of changing them because they will work for the majority. I guess this also brings me neatly onto my next area about how do we create change in such a slow-moving space. We spoke about it on a much larger scale, but let's home in again on the workplace, in particular local government, which is renowned for moving at a snail's pace. How does someone who wants to move the needle or move the conversation forward, how do you manage with a process which is known for being slow?
Oh, it's not easy now. Look, to be completely honest, I have often wondered whether local government has been the right space for me because of my own frustrations with that pace. And it definitely took 2 or 3 years, I would say, for me to really suss out how to expedite things in a useful way. You described me as a disruptor earlier, and funnily enough, it's not the first time that's been said about me, which has never been a conscious thing on my part, certainly, but I've taken it as positive.
It is positive.
I think but there is a knack to learning how to do it without damaging your professional relationships, because ultimately, if you get that balance wrong, things go even slower. Actually,
no one likes a difficult person. Disruptor, positive connotations, but easily could be perceived as someone who, why would anyone take you seriously? And there's also that thing about picking your battles. If you're the type of person who wants to change the world, you notice everything that's wrong with it. But if you are scattering your interest too far and wide, no one will take the kind of your key elements serious. I guess that's another question, actually, is how do you pick which battles to fight, and how do you accept the pace at which they change?
I have a very long multicolored list. So I don't think I've ever not picked a battle. I've picked my timing.
Okay.
And the things that I can't. So I still have things on my very long multicolored list from, I'm pretty sure, 2020, which are not over the line yet and are not where I'd like them to be yet. And that's been about being able to recognize that the space around me isn't necessarily ready in terms of its mindset, nor always geared up to practically do anything. I suppose it's a bit like betting odds. I don't know. I'm not a gambler. That might not be the right analogy, but you have to have a harsh, pragmatic conversation with yourself about realistically all of these things which need to be done. All of them are important. I don't feel, when I've recognized something, that there's ever been anything that I could say, it's not that bad, leave it as it is. It might be a smaller or a lesser impact, but that's not justification to take it off of the very long list, in my view. Yeah. I think what I found is that talking about the right thing at the right time to the right person is a useful thing to do. Good example at Oxfordshire, actually. All of our staff networks are in the process of getting to work with senior leaders to have corporate sponsorship. This is newish for us.
Yeah.
But what it does, so some of the things around neurodiversity, for example, that have been sitting on my list for 2 or 3 years and I haven't had anywhere to go with yet, actually, by helping the organisation to move on as a whole and to modernise how it thinks and be more open to change, that's helped us with this step forwards around our corporate sponsors. And ultimately, that gives me a named senior person to go and talk to about those things, which, granted, have been on that list for far too long. And that's not okay. But better late than never. So I'd rather be able to have the conversation at some point in a useful way and actually have a person to work with, someone who can escalate, assign resources, support, make visible, which is all of the missing components. So when I realized this quite a long time ago, those were components that were missing from, and would certainly prevent me or very much hinder my success in terms of trying to bring a change. So I suppose I have made a conscious choice at times to not pursue things where I was going to be putting colleagues in an impossible situation because they didn't have the knowledge or the experience necessarily, nor the tools to be able to help. What I would say, though, is that sometimes bringing the impact of a problem or a shortfalling that we've had to what is, by and large, I think I can say almost exclusively in my experience, a group of ethical and committed people. The most common response that I've had is, oh, heck, that's not good. Got to do something. And so that might not be loads of knowledge, and it might not be bringing all of the answers and all of the solutions and all of the improvements necessarily in that conversation. But what it brings is that you've been able to open somebody's eyes to something which they also now don't want that guilty knowledge of. They don't want to continue condoning. Had they have known sooner, they'd have been there sooner. And although that might put us right at the beginning of being able to bring an improvement, we're starting. And that's the most important step, right? So lots of this work has been iterative. And I think probably one of the tactics that I've used in quite a deliberate way is to suggest, so to make the problem visible, suggest one or two things, often around education, often around comms, often around just making visible as a first iteration or a first step in improving how we work. And what you then find is people join you along the way. So people will come to me and say, hey, I heard about this and I didn't really know anything about it. So thank you for telling me. And I still feel really ignorant, but can I help? And at that point, you bite their arm off, kidnap them, and lock them in a room until they face it. No, you don't do any of it. With my tiny stature, I'm definitely not able to physically haul somebody away into a room until they fix the problem. But it's so interesting, the energy that comes when someone's motivated themselves because of what they now know that they didn't know last week.
Absolutely. I think sustainable change absolutely takes time. When you rush it, it doesn't stick. And I like the idea of opening Pandora's box without necessarily having the answers or the right time to fix it, but bringing people along for the journey.
Yeah. And you have to have everybody along for the journey, don't you?
Yeah. I said, if you're not on the bus, you get left behind, and you want everyone to.
And also, when it's big high-level change, policy change, that's just about 5,000 people, I think. It's not a number.
Oh, no.
I can't do that. I'd love to be able to wave a magic wand and make it improved immediately, wouldn't we all? But can't do it without other people helping you and supporting you and lending you their skills and expertise and their corporate memory sometimes. And then you start to understand where some of your missteps might have been, beauty of hindsight. But those conversations then become so much more productive. But I think the key change is motivating somebody to bring a positive change and work with you rather than bringing a complaint or bringing conflict, or because that kind of puts you at loggerheads and makes the whole thing slower. So there's a way of bringing people with you. But you know what's been really lovely is that kind of, oh, that's not great, that response that I'm pretty familiar with by now is actually really heartening, because for a moment, that person's kind of heart sinking for a minute, which can be uncomfortable, but actually their discomfort is generally less than for those on the wrong side of whatever systemic barrier we're talking about at that time. It's enough to prompt them to act. And that's the point. Sometimes things have to kind of impact you enough to make you get on your feet and do the things and take on the extra activity or shape up that project that we didn't know we needed.
Yeah. I often find that you do need to help people find their personal connection to whatever barrier. For instance, I used to talk about dyslexia, autism, etc. I actually more talk about neurodiversity now, diversity of thought, because it's about saying, hey, this isn't just about one person who you may or may not have a connection with. It's about everyone. And the same thing with kind of race, gender, sexuality. This is something which does impact you, even if you don't see it. And what you're doing is connecting the dots. You did speak a moment ago about finding the right timings, and that's definitely an area that I would love to know a bit more about. Follow-up question, how do you strategically challenge business as usual while preserving trust and stability? Because I often find you've got people who may not be at the top of the food chain, but are really passionate, but then people who are the decision makers, they have a completely different set of agenda, and any sort of disruption that you might bring to them would only kind of impact business, at least in the short term, in a negative way?
Bringing people together, I think, is probably the key step in doing that challenge. So exactly as you say, your operational colleagues, your colleagues with vast amounts of lived experience, and that disconnect with our leaders can set us up for problems, actually. So making those people more connected. I'm a big fan of a flat structure, I have to say. It takes a bit of confidence, like it takes a bit of undoing some of the things we've been taught about who's important and who gets a voice and all of that. You have to be willing to undo that training, I think, a little bit. But it works, I think. So the network activity, so the network chairing activity has probably been the most powerful for me in this respect, because you are an employee who takes on a voluntary responsibility, which in a well-meaning way and in a completely professional way means you can do what you want to an extent. You can have really honest and open conversations with your community and that network, and then just go and knock on someone's door, because all of our networks work differently. There's no model. They're all kind of volunteer run, so it's difficult to performance manage anybody or tell them they're getting it wrong. And that actually is a real gift, because who's going to stop you sometimes?
Yeah.
So then I've worn the network hat in that way, and it served me really actually at times, because I have just sent a cheeky email or a cheeky Teams message sometimes to say, I'm the chair of the Reach Network, and I was wondering about this. Could we just have a conversation? Would you mind? And generally, I've had a really positive response. And if you really can't get a hold of somebody, try somebody else. There's literally the beauty of that network structure is the independence, the kind of, there's not a complete lack of process, like we have governance in terms of reference and all the things that you'd expect. But in terms of our day-to-day, all of our networks at Oxfordshire operate really differently, actually, and function differently, but as you'd imagine, because the communities that make them up are all different and need different things. So it's really nice as an aside, lovely way to learn about what things you can do, like between the networks. That's always a really lovely opportunity that I relish, actually, at work. But in terms of challenging that business as usual, you can cut through a lot of the and a lot of the, you wait for this meeting date and you put it on an agenda, and at some point you'll get your turn to be able to talk to some people who might think, don't do any of that, because we're not in those spaces. We're in this much more kind of literal, tangible space.
That's so interesting. It's really made me rethink the benefit of different employee networks, because they aren't business as usual. It sounds like somewhat Wild West, where you get to create more kind of grassroots projects. You have that more freedom. And I like the idea of being cheeky, because if in a more professional setting, let's say you work in HR, you still have your own policies to proceed, you still have your own hierarchy, whereas because you are in a voluntary role, it gives you more freedoms to put your foot out there, and there are less repercussions. So yeah, it sounds like a really pragmatic, strategic way of getting your voice heard without following the status quo.
And it's really interesting. The networks for me have been this living proof of how, when you are in a properly inclusive space, you really thrive. So when I talk to networks, and I go to other network meetings as well, not just Reach, I'm a member of others, but when you talk to people, they speak so freely and with so much energy and so much truth. And that is always a really powerful conversation.
Yeah.
And then you can see sometimes those same colleagues out in their professional spaces, and they're not the same, but they're not as visible somehow. Sometimes they're just quieter.
Yeah.
And so it's so rewarding.
Safety, where you feel comfortable because you're among your peers.
Yeah. And when you feel welcome in a space, all of you is welcome. So there's all these other facets to people's character that they bring with them into the network spaces, which aren't necessarily in the corporate or the professional spaces. But those conversations are always so energizing. And it's something we've done in the Reach Network. We have an annual conversation about our aims and what we would like to see different or better this time next year. And so we have that kind of loose strategy, and we structure our conversations to bring us the information and the energy and the fire to continue pursuing that way, and those changes in whichever way we think is going to be the most successful. So again, and as you say, it's that take the process away, isn't it? And then suddenly things become so fruitful.
I really like the idea of getting those kind of lived experience and personal perspectives from everyone, getting views heard and shared. I would be curious to know, though, how do you take these kind of personal stories and put them into more official policies? Because I know people often worry that these chats may just be token gestures or preachers converted. So I'd love to know your experience on how do you make these open conversations meaningful in the long run?
That risk that you mentioned, actually, about people worrying that this is tokenism, or that's very valid. And that is a thing that definitely exists in every corporate space that I've come across. It's not always deliberate, but it is a thing. So it's important to recognize that, I think. In terms of material change, so to our policies and our process, so that can be one of the slower bits. And I've taken a couple of approaches in terms of gathering those stories. People share them really willingly, which is really helpful. And so we can just do straightforward data capture and forms and surveys and things that sort of do that in quite a neat way. But the interesting thing is people won't engage you. So it comes back to your point about psychological safety, right? So people won't engage with that stuff unless you've built those relationships with them and they feel genuinely invested in sometimes sharing something which might be re-traumatizing, sometimes sharing something which might be ongoing today, and making themselves vulnerable enough to do gathering information all the straightforward ways, the obvious guessable ways. There's probably no big secrets in that. So yeah, building the relationship, having that sort of real basis of trust. And I think it's probably fair to say, so I co-chair with 4 other women with Reach, and we've all, I think it's fair to say, had to prove ourselves, because you can't just have the conversation and then do nothing.
Yeah.
So we're all really transparent, and we share that. We say, this is the conversation I had and this is what I escalated. So at Oxfordshire, we have an EDI steering group, which is corporate. All of our corporate leaders can attend that, network representatives and representatives from around the organisation. So where we have something that we would like to lead to a policy development, or it might be a change of process, it might be education, it might be training, that kind of thing. But we're lucky in that we have a space to bring that, to share the load, to assign that activity to people who are empowered and in the right position to be able to do something about it, to secure commitment, that sort of thing. So things can go into that space. It's interesting that space has had learning to do. So you know what they say about the road to hell? And there can be lots of really good intentions in that room, but without good information and without leaning on exactly those frontline stories that you describe, you can still think you've done the right thing, but actually either have missed it entirely or only gotten a result that's half as good as it could have been. You can still miss. So something that group has learned along the way has been about working much more closely with colleagues with lived experience. And there's had to be some training out of that habit of that nice dismissing that can happen, or not to it there, that's probably a one-off, or that sort of thing where there's a well-meaning person who wants you to not feel as bad as you obviously do about the difficult thing that you might have presented them with, but ultimately ends up closing the conversation and really limiting the process.
Yeah.
That we've had to learn that as a group about not doing that and being able to really sit in an uncomfortable spot with a real big headache where we don't feel like we've always got the skills and the knowledge to get it right. And actually the obvious step is work more closely with those voices from that front line, bring them into the conversation, because it's funny how much people have to say when you just open the door on that. I
think that's a really great perspective about sitting in an uncomfortable space, because you are right. If you hear someone who says something like dreadful, like, oh, I've been diagnosed with cancer, you want to automatically say it's going to be okay, but like it can undermine it, or oh yeah, I'm neurodivergent, and say, don't worry, there are positives. It can undermine it, and actually you don't need to have answers, just being there and then coming up with ideas together. And I could see that could be quite a lot of pressure on yourself from taking all these different ideas and maybe feeling that you need to give automatic solutions, and there isn't always going to be them.
Yeah, so something as a group of co-chairs, particularly around race issues, where we're talking about that kind of stuff, we've had to sometimes be okay with saying, yeah, this is really bad. I'm really sorry that this is what the world looks like today. But you look at the stuff that we're seeing in the global news, it can be in any space, can't it? We've had our differences with us, whether we're at work, at home, at play, wherever. And our agendas are open for anything that's relevant for anyone at that time. But yeah, we've had to just get used to being able to say, yeah, that's rubbish. Just let it hang there. Because sometimes that is just the reality of it. And I always think it's better to do that than minimize in any way.
Oh,
That feels
completely.
worse.
Particularly with the state of the world at the moment. It's so easy to get in a rut and then you try to do the sunny side upside, but it's okay to be dissatisfied with how kind of things are.
Right.
Because actually, that's kind of like the toxic positivity, which can make other people feel that I don't feel that positive about it. Am I in the wrong? And,
Yeah, completely. Yeah. And the one doesn't negate the other. So you can say, this thing is utterly dreadful. And that can be the case, as well as there still being other really great things, right? This is not the final judgment of life, the universe, and everything. That's not what we're saying. But it is recognizing the truth about any given scenario without having to try and roll it in glitter and make it seem nicer.
Yeah, I think that does relate quite heavily to neurodivergence, where it was previously doom and gloom. Oh my God, you got autism. I'm so sorry. To, wow, look at that superpower. I'm like, it doesn't have to be
Whoa.
one or the other.
Yeah.
It is what it is. It can be neutral, positive, negative, and whatever it is, that's okay.
And yeah, and you know, the thing, like, I love how you framed that and laid it out. And the next bit that kind of comes in for me, hearing you say that, Nat, isn't that the case for everybody? Nobody is brilliant at everything. Everybody is bad at some things. And we each have a different combination of the things. Like, it's not, we would never take one characteristic or one ability or one strength or one weakness about any given person and make that all that they are.
Yeah, and if you did, it just wouldn't be true. For instance, they say don't idolize false icons. Celebrities are all flawed individuals. When I look at people I admire, you have to take them for all that they are and not just the individual things. Or even if you look at like superheroes, I can't think of a single superhero that people actually like, which is perfect. All the ones we love are inherently flawed, and it's the flaws that make them who they are.
And often what draws you to them.
Yeah, like Batman with no kind of childhood trauma. Don't care.
Not bothered.
Superman, who wasn't allergic, I guess, to kryptonite, just too damn perfect. It's one of the reasons I don't like the Incredible Hulk too much, because if he's invincible, you need to have the vulnerability, and that kind of that opens you up to collaboration. And that's why I think sometimes people who think differently and might have struggles, without completely undermining the challenges, the strengths that kind of come along with it typically are kind of adversary strengths opposed to inherently part of it. Now, I want to finish on one kind of more kind of forward focusing question about what we can do next. If you could implement one radical overnight policy, intersectional inclusion, what would it be and why? So you got no boundaries here. You got complete dictatorship. What are you going to do?
In my day job or anywhere?
I'll leave it up to you.
I guess we can make it so that it applies to both. I would have all people, whether they're in a working space and whether they're going through education, but a self-learning program where you learn about yourself, what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what likely barriers you may face, and know them and understand them because they're a reality of where we are today. One thing that I've seen with all of the professionals that I've worked with in this space, whether it's been about neurodiversity, whether it's been about race, is that we all, because actually I include myself in this too, we all have had to learn lots about ourselves. And when you know that, so it wasn't until somebody else called me a disruptor, for example, that I thought, oh, okay, that's probably right, actually. And so initially I was uncomfortable because to be described as disruptive at school is not a good thing. That's not welcome. So my instinct when I first heard it was, not sure about that. I'm not sure I like that. And then when I went away and reflected, I thought, actually, whether I like it or not, it's probably true. I need to lean into that and accept it about myself. And then you're able to play to your strengths, right? So don't we all need to know what our strengths are to be able to thrive? And that can be about, I think it applies to every difference, actually. And the combination of those is where things can get really powerful, I think. So for me, I'm doing some work at the moment in the allyship space to promote Black women in professional environments. I'm not a Black woman, but of course what it means is that I can go and speak about the common challenges and champion their voice in a really easy way. I'm not directly affected by those issues. So if I don't know, I can say I don't know, but I'd like to go and find out and hold the conversation. I can't really be put in a situation where I might be accused of championing a certain issue because it's in my self-interest too. It's not, because none of it applies to me. But I also can use those close female relationships, for example, to have the open and honest conversations and lean on those colleagues to almost wind me up and point me so that I can go and make some positive change around me. I wouldn't have ever put myself in those situations had I not have gone through that process of understanding my own differences, my own strengths, and my own weaknesses. So I also now have had so much more success at work and so much more success trying to do the things that I try to achieve at work by saying, I'm probably best not to ask me to do that because it will be a lower quality output, or it might not even get done at all. And it's just better to be honest about it so that you're able to see that kind of overall success in a collaborative way.
So it's understanding yourself is really important. And then that kind of opens you up to having greater empathy for other people, and then knowing where your input is most useful, and then knowing when other people are to bring on, while still being able to be an ally.
That's happened for me just accidentally or by chance, I don't know. But if somebody had sat down and helped me with that, either at school or in my staff induction or as ongoing, continuing professional development in my job, if I'd have had that sooner, I think I'd probably have been able to have had much more success, and I think I'd have thrived in my spaces sooner, both professionally and personally.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's something that I wish I knew about myself more.
Right.
Or rather than having something you learn because you have no choice but to learn, for it to be more of a foundation cornerstone. So as this whole chat talking about intersectionality, how it takes lots of different elements. If you do get labeled with something, you define yourself by that label. And being so one-dimensional is going to have negativities towards it.
Absolutely.
I know, being more open. And this is why I've been loving doing these conversations, particularly with people that might not directly relate with being neurodivergent, because I want to speak to allies. I want to speak to advocates. I want to know, how do we get everyone along the journey, even if they don't have, or they don't seemingly have a direct connection. I suppose, as much as I would love to talk for the rest of the day because it's so interesting, and you absolutely smashed all the questions, by the way, despite not being the easiest.
Did I?
Absolutely. Hearts of flying colours. I just want to say thank you so much for attending today and speaking.
Thanks for having me. I can't believe how quickly an hour went.
I know, honestly, time flies when you're a really tough question.
Oh, it's been really nice to catch up. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Hope to see you again soon.
Agreed.